The blizzard had been screaming across the Dakota plains for 2 days when Thomas Whitmore realized he was going to die. The white trader huddled behind his dead horse, which the storm had killed that morning. His compass spun uselessly in circles, the magnetic anomaly of the Black Hills rendering it worthless. The sun hadn't shown itself since the storm began. He had no idea which direction led to Fort Pierre, which led deeper into the emptiness that would freeze him solid by dawn. That's when he saw the figure approaching through the white chaos. A Lakota hunter moving with absolute purpose through conditions that had reduced Whitmore to a shivering, lost animal. The man wasn't wandering, he wasn't searching. He was walking a straight line as if following a road only he could see. The hunter stopped 10 feet away, studying the white man with the calm assessment of someone who had seen this before. Traders, soldiers, settlers, all lost in storms they didn't understand, on plains they couldn't read. He said something in Lakota that Whitmore didn't understand. Then he gestured, "Follow." Whitmore stumbled after him into the screaming white. For 3 days they walked through conditions that seemed designed to kill. The hunter never hesitated, never paused to get his bearings, never showed the slightest uncertainty about direction. He walked as if he could see through the storm to something beyond it. On the 3rd evening, as the blizzard finally broke, they crested a rise and Whitmore saw Fort Pierre below them, exactly where the hunter had been leading them. 3 days of perfect navigation through a storm that had obliterated every landmark, with no sun, no compass, no visible reference point of any kind. Whitmore grabbed the hunter's arm, desperate to understand. "How? How did you know where to go?" The Lakota man looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to emerge through the breaking clouds. He pointed to a cluster near the horizon, then traced a line across the darkness to another group overhead. His meaning was clear even without shared language. "I followed the stars. I never lost them. Even in the storm, I knew where they were." What Whitmore was witnessing was the product of a navigation system so sophisticated that modern astronomers still study how it was possible. The Lakota and other plains tribes possessed complete celestial knowledge that allowed navigation with accuracy that matched, and in some ways exceeded, European instruments. They could determine precise latitude, identify true north without magnetic variation, navigate in conditions that rendered compasses useless, and pass through terrain with no landmarks, using only the night sky as their guide. This is the kind of story we explore here at Old West Archives. The moments when indigenous scientific knowledge proved superior to European technology, when survival depended on astronomical expertise refined across centuries. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover the sophisticated knowledge systems that shaped the American frontier. And tell us in the comments what aspect of Native American navigation or astronomy interests you most. Now, to understand what that Lakota hunter knew, and how his people developed navigation capabilities that seemed impossible to European observers, we need to understand the plains themselves and why they demanded such precise celestial knowledge. The Great Plains stretch from Canada to Texas, a vast expanse of grassland where the horizon seems to curve with the earth itself. To European settlers arriving in the 1800s, these plains appeared as a featureless ocean of grass, monotonous, disorienting, deadly to the unprepared. Military reports from the 1860s describe soldiers becoming hopelessly lost within sight of their own forts. Wagon trains would circle for days, convinced they were making progress, only to stumble back upon their own wheel ruts. The problem wasn't the plains themselves. The problem was that Europeans tried to navigate them using systems designed for different environments. Compasses worked well in eastern forests, where magnetic north remained relatively consistent. But the plains contained iron deposits and magnetic anomalies that could swing a compass needle 20 degrees off true north. Landmarks, the foundation of European overland navigation, were scarce and unreliable. A creek bed that ran full in spring might be completely dry by summer. A distinctive rock formation could be hidden by prairie grass that grew 8 feet tall. Distance became impossible to judge on terrain where the horizon was always the same distance away. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, and other Plains tribes, these weren't obstacles, they were home. But living on the plains required navigation capabilities that seemed supernatural to outsiders. Hunting parties would leave camp and return weeks later, having traveled hundreds of miles in pursuit of buffalo herds, arriving back at specific meeting points with perfect timing. War parties could strike targets days of travel away, then vanish into terrain where pursuing soldiers would become hopelessly disoriented. Trade delegations would cross vast distances to rendezvous with other tribes at precise locations and times. The foundation of this navigation capability was astronomy. Plains peoples had developed complete celestial knowledge systems that allowed them to use the night sky as a comprehensive navigation tool. This wasn't simple stargazing or mythology. It was rigorous scientific observation, refined across centuries, passed from generation to generation through teaching methods that ensured precision and accuracy. The sophistication of Plains astronomy becomes clear when we examine what they actually knew and how they used that knowledge. We're not talking about recognizing a few constellations. We're talking about complete celestial maps, understanding of stellar motion, knowledge of seasonal variation, latitude determination, and navigation techniques that worked in conditions where European methods failed completely. The winter of 1862, when Thomas Whitmore nearly died on the Dakota Plains, was part of a brutal season that killed dozens of travelers who ventured onto the plains unprepared. Military records from Fort Pierre document 11 separate incidents of soldiers or civilians becoming fatally lost in storms that winter. The common factor in almost every case was reliance on compasses that proved unreliable and lack of alternative navigation methods when visibility dropped. Meanwhile, Lakota hunting parties were moving across the same terrain in the same conditions without incident. They weren't luckier or tougher. They possessed knowledge that Europeans hadn't bothered to learn or didn't believe was real. When Army officers asked Lakota guides how they navigated in storms, the answers seemed like mysticism. We follow the sky roads, we read the star patterns, we know where the sky touches the earth. What these guides were describing wasn't mysticism. It was astronomy so precise and practical that it functioned as a complete navigation system, requiring no instruments whatsoever. Every piece of information a navigator needed, direction, position, time, season, was encoded in the night sky for those who knew how to read it. The foundation of Lakota celestial navigation was intimate knowledge of stellar patterns and their movements. What Europeans called constellations and used primarily for maritime navigation, Plains peoples understood in far greater depth and practical detail. They didn't just recognize star patterns, they understood how those patterns moved, why they moved, and what that movement meant for navigation and seasonal tracking. The Lakota observed and categorized hundreds of stars in stellar groupings. Each had names, stories, and practical applications. But certain star groups were especially critical for navigation, forming what could be thought of as the primary road signs of the night sky. The most important of these was what the Lakota called Wichapi Owangila, what Europeans would call Polaris, the North Star. But the Lakota understanding went far beyond simply knowing it indicated north. They understood why it appeared stationary while other stars moved around it. They knew its precise elevation angle corresponded to latitude. The higher it appeared above the horizon, the farther north you were. They had mapped this relationship so accurately that experienced navigators could determine their latitude to within a few miles just by measuring the star's elevation with their hand or arm against the horizon. This wasn't casual observation. It was mathematics applied through embodied measurement. A Lakota navigator would extend his arm fully, measure the distance from horizon to Polaris using fingers or hand widths, and know his latitude. The technique was taught with precision. Fingers together, arm fully extended. Measure from the true horizon, not hills or trees. The consistency of this method across individuals was achieved through standardized teaching. Children learned using the same reference points, the same measurement techniques, creating a shared system that produced reliable results. Around Wichanpi, Owangala moved other critical navigation stars. What Europeans called the Big Dipper, the Lakota knew as a group with multiple names and uses. The two stars forming the outer edge of the cup, what astronomers call the pointer stars, had special significance because they always pointed toward Polaris. In conditions where Polaris itself was obscured by clouds or haze, navigators could find it by following the line through these pointer stars. This redundancy in the system meant navigation could continue even when primary reference points were temporarily invisible. But planes navigation went far beyond simply finding north. The Lakota had mapped the entire visible sky into a comprehensive navigation grid that functioned regardless of season or time of night. This required understanding the apparent rotation of the celestial sphere, how stars rise in the east, arc across the southern sky, and set in the west, and how this pattern varies with latitude and season. The ecliptic, the path the sun, moon, and planets follow across the sky, was central to Lakota astronomical knowledge. They tracked the sun's position along this path throughout the year, understanding how it correlated with seasons, weather patterns, and animal migrations. But more importantly for navigation, they understood how stellar patterns along the ecliptic could be used to determine both direction and time. The Pleiades star cluster, which the Lakota called the Seven Sisters, served multiple navigation functions. Its position in the sky indicated both season and time of night. In autumn, when the Pleiades rose in the east at sunset, it signaled the beginning of the buffalo mating season and the time when herds would gather in specific locations. For navigators, the cluster's position provided a reliable east-west reference point that was highly visible and easily recognized. Orion, with its distinctive belt of 3 bright stars, provided another crucial navigation marker. The Lakota understood that Orion's belt rises due east and sets due west, regardless of season or latitude. This made it an invaluable direction reference, especially when Polaris was obscured. The belt's 3 stars were also used for timekeeping. Their position in the sky indicated how much of the night had passed, allowing navigators to calculate travel time and distance. The Milky Way itself served as a navigation tool. The Lakota called it the Spirit Path, and they understood its orientation changed with the seasons. In winter, it ran roughly north-south across the sky. In summer, it angled from northeast to southwest. This seasonal variation was mapped with precision. Navigators could use the Milky Way's angle to determine both direction and approximate date, adding another layer of redundancy to the navigation system. But recognizing stellar patterns was only the beginning. The real sophistication came in understanding stellar motion and using that understanding for precise navigation over long distances. The Lakota knew that stars don't simply move randomly across the sky. They move in predictable arcs, determined by their position relative to the celestial poles and the observer's latitude. Stars near the celestial equator, the imaginary line around the sky directly above Earth's equator, rise and set at steep angles. Stars farther north or south rise and set at shallower angles. This meant that by observing a star's arc across the sky, a navigator could determine its position on the celestial sphere and use that information to maintain direction even as the star moved. This concept is abstract in description, but was taught through direct, practical observation. A Lakota child learning navigation would spend nights watching specific stars, memorizing their paths, understanding how their motion correlated with direction. The teaching method emphasized embodied knowledge, learning through repeated observation until the sky's patterns became intuitive, readable at a glance. The result was navigators who could maintain direction by following a sequence of stars throughout the night. As one star set in the west, they would shift to another that was rising in the east, maintaining their bearing through continuous adjustment. This wasn't following a single star like some mythical Christmas star. It was sophisticated celestial navigation, using the entire sky as a dynamic reference system. The practical application of this knowledge during the 3-day journey that saved Thomas Whitmore's life demonstrates the system's power. The Lakota hunter guiding him through the blizzard wasn't guessing. He was navigating with precision that would have impressed professional navigators. Even in a blizzard with heavy cloud cover, the hunter maintained his heading because he understood the sky's geometry. During brief breaks in the clouds, moments that occurred several times each night, he would identify stellar reference points, confirm his latitude and bearing, then maintain that heading as the clouds closed in again. His knowledge of star positions was so precise that these glimpses, lasting perhaps seconds, provided enough information to navigate for hours. The technique relied on understanding the relationship between stellar positions and geographic locations. The hunter knew that Fort Pierre was located at a specific latitude, identifiable by Polaris's elevation. He knew the fort lay in a specific direction from their starting point, identifiable by stellar alignments along that bearing. And he knew the approximate distance, which he calculated by combining stellar timekeeping with his knowledge of walking speed in various conditions. This combination of astronomical knowledge and embodied understanding of distance and terrain created navigation capabilities that seemed impossible to observers who didn't understand the underlying system. Army officers who witnessed similar feats of plains navigation sometimes accused guides of having supernatural powers, or suggested they must have traveled the exact route before. Neither was true. They were simply applying sophisticated scientific knowledge that Europeans hadn't developed for overland navigation. The precision of Lakota astronomical observation becomes even more remarkable when we examine their understanding of stellar parallax and seasonal variation. Parallax, the apparent shift in a star's position when viewed from different locations, was something Lakota navigators used practically long before European astronomers formalized it mathematically. Experienced navigators understood that certain stars appeared at different elevations depending on latitude. By memorizing the elevation of specific stars at known locations, they could determine their north-south position anywhere on the plains. This was essentially latitude determination through stellar observation, the same principle used in maritime navigation, but applied to overland travel without instruments. The teaching of this knowledge required remarkable precision and consistency. Young Lakota learning navigation would be taken to specific locations, prominent landmarks whose position was well known, and taught to observe stellar elevations from those points. They would memorize not just the stars themselves, but their exact positions relative to the horizon. This embodied learning created a living celestial map that could be carried anywhere and consulted at any time. The seasonal variation of the night sky added complexity that Lakota astronomers had thoroughly mapped. The visible stars change throughout the year as Earth orbits the Sun, with different stellar patterns dominating different seasons. What's visible in winter is hidden by daylight in summer. What rises in the east in spring rises in the northeast in summer. Lakota navigators had memorized these seasonal variations and understood their causes. They knew the sun moved along the ecliptic, changing its position relative to the background stars. They understood that this movement correlated with Earth's seasons, animal migrations, plant growth patterns, and weather changes. This holistic understanding meant astronomical knowledge wasn't just for navigation. It was integrated into every aspect of life, requiring seasonal awareness. For practical navigation, seasonal variation meant adjusting stellar reference points throughout the year. A navigation route that followed one set of stars in winter would require different stellar markers in summer. This wasn't a limitation, it was additional information. By observing which stars were visible and where they appeared, navigators could determine approximate date as well as location. This temporal awareness was crucial for coordinating movements of dispersed groups, planning hunts, and managing seasonal migrations. The integration of lunar observation into the navigation system added another layer of sophistication. The moon's phases and position provided timekeeping, directional reference, and seasonal indicators that complemented stellar navigation. The Lakota understood the moon's orbital mechanics in practical terms. They knew why it rose and set at different times, why its path across the sky varied, and how to use these variations for navigation and timekeeping. The moon rising full in the east provided the same directional reference as a star on the celestial equator. The crescent moon's horns always pointed away from the sun's position, providing directional information even when the sun itself was below the horizon. The moon's position relative to specific star groups indicated its phase and allowed calculation of approximate date. All of this information was integrated into a comprehensive system that used every visible celestial object as a potential navigation aid. What made this system superior to European compass navigation in many plains conditions wasn't just its astronomical sophistication. It was the integration of multiple information sources into a coherent whole. A Lakota navigator wasn't relying on a single instrument that could fail or provide false readings. He was synthesizing information from dozens of sources: stellar positions, lunar phase, atmospheric conditions, terrain features, animal behavior, creating a robust navigation system that maintained accuracy even when individual elements were unavailable. The training required to master this system began in early childhood and continued throughout life. Young Lakota children learned star stories that encoded astronomical knowledge in narrative form. These weren't just entertainment, they were mnemonic devices that helped memorize stellar patterns, seasonal variations, and practical applications. A story about how the seven sisters came to be in the sky wasn't just mythology. It encoded information about the Pleiades' seasonal movement, their rising and setting times, and their navigation utility. A story about a hero following the spirit path wasn't just adventure. It taught that the Milky Way's orientation changed with seasons and could be used for direction finding. As children grew older, the teaching became more explicit and technical. They would be taken on night walks, where elders would point out specific stars, explain their names and meanings, and demonstrate how to use them for navigation. The teaching emphasized practical application, not just identifying stars, but using them to maintain bearing, determine position, and calculate distance. The teaching method relied heavily on repetition and embodied learning. Children would practice star identification until it became automatic. They would walk predetermined routes at night, learning to navigate by stars alone. They would be tested, sent in specific directions with instructions to maintain bearing, then checked to see if they arrived at the expected location. This rigorous training produced navigators whose skill seemed supernatural to outside observers, but there was nothing supernatural about it. It was the result of systematic education in astronomical observation and application, supported by cultural knowledge transmission that had been refined across centuries. The practical advantages of this navigation system over European methods became especially apparent in the challenging conditions common on the plains. Magnetic compasses, the primary European navigation tool for overland travel, failed or became unreliable in several situations that didn't affect celestial navigation. The Black Hills region and other areas with iron deposits created magnetic anomalies that could swing compass needles dramatically off true north. European navigators using compasses in these regions would sometimes find themselves traveling in circles, their instruments pointing in directions that had no relationship to true north. Lakota navigators using stellar references were unaffected. Polaris indicated true north, regardless of magnetic conditions. Heavy overcast that made stellar observation difficult or impossible affected both systems. But Lakota navigators had developed techniques for maintaining bearing even without direct sky visibility. They understood prevailing wind patterns and how they correlated with direction in different seasons. They could read subtle terrain features, the way grass bent, the erosion patterns on rocks, the orientation of plant growth, that provided directional information independent of celestial observation. These terrestrial indicators weren't fallback methods used when celestial navigation failed. They were integrated parts of a comprehensive system. A skilled navigator would use multiple information sources simultaneously, each confirming and refining the others. Stars provided primary direction reference. Wind patterns confirmed that direction. Terrain features added detail about local geography. The result was navigation that remained accurate, even when individual information sources were degraded. The system's redundancy became critical during extended periods of poor visibility. During the 3 days the Lakota hunter guided Thomas Whitmore through the blizzard, direct stellar observation was possible only intermittently. But those brief observations provided enough information to maintain accurate bearing for hours between glimpses of the sky. The navigator wasn't stumbling blindly between observations. He was maintaining precise awareness of his heading, using internalized knowledge of stellar positions and careful attention to his own movement. This integration of celestial navigation with embodied spatial awareness, the ability to maintain dead reckoning over extended distances, was perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Lakota navigation. Dead reckoning, the practice of tracking position by calculating distance and direction from a known starting point, requires constant attention to movement and remarkable spatial memory. Lakota navigators learned to count paces automatically, tracking distance unconsciously, even while attending to other tasks. They developed acute awareness of their own walking speed in different conditions, through deep grass, across hard ground, uphill, downhill. They learned to adjust distance calculations for terrain, weather, and the weight of burdens carried. All of this became automatic through years of practice, until navigators could track their position relative to any starting point without conscious calculation. The combination of stellar navigation and dead reckoning created capabilities that seemed impossible to European observers. A Lakota guide could set out across featureless prairie, walk for days through conditions that made observation difficult, then arrive at a specific meeting point with accuracy measured in tens of yards. Army officers witnessing this would sometimes accuse guides of trickery or prior knowledge of the route. They simply couldn't believe navigation could be that precise without instruments. But the precision was real, and it was reproducible. Multiple accounts from military officers, traders, and settlers describe similar feats of navigation. George Catlin, who lived among Plains tribes in the 1830s, documented navigation capabilities that he initially dismissed as exaggeration until he witnessed them personally. He described a Lakota hunter who guided him to a specific campsite 3 days' travel away, arriving within sight of the target after traveling through a severe thunderstorm that lasted most of the second day. Catlin was particularly impressed by the navigator's ability to maintain bearing during the storm when no celestial observation was possible. The navigator explained through an interpreter that he maintained direction by feeling the wind. Its strength and angle indicated direction based on seasonal wind patterns he had memorized. When Catlin expressed skepticism, the navigator demonstrated by walking blindfolded in a straight line across rough terrain for over a mile, maintaining heading to within a few degrees of his intended direction. These demonstrations weren't showmanship. They were practical skills essential for survival on terrain where getting lost could be fatal. The plains environment demanded navigation precision. Water sources were widely scattered and often difficult to locate. Getting lost while hunting could mean death from exposure or starvation. Military conflicts required the ability to strike targets and retreat along routes that avoided pursuit. The tactical advantages of superior navigation became dramatically clear during conflicts between Plains tribes and U.S. military forces in the 1860s and 1870s. Army columns equipped with compasses, maps, and sometimes celestial navigation instruments would pursue Native American warriors who seemed to vanish into terrain the soldiers found disorienting. The dynamic wasn't about hiding. It was about navigation. Warriors could move quickly across country because they knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. Army columns moved slowly because they had to constantly check instruments, confirm positions, and adjust routes. Warriors could travel at night with confidence. Soldiers had to stop and camp because their navigation systems required daylight, or at minimum, clear skies for astronomical observation. Military after-action reports from the Indian Wars repeatedly described frustration at the inability to catch or even track Native American groups. What's often interpreted as superior tracking and wilderness survival skills was in significant part superior navigation. Warriors weren't just better at moving through terrain, they fundamentally understood it better through their astronomical knowledge system. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 provides a specific example. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors coordinated movements of thousands of people across hundreds of miles of terrain, concentrating forces at a specific location for a decisive engagement. This required precise navigation and timing that depended on their astronomical knowledge system. Meanwhile, Custer's 7th Cavalry became separated and disoriented in terrain they didn't understand, making tactical errors that contributed to their disastrous defeat. This isn't to reduce military outcomes to navigation alone, but navigation capabilities were a significant factor that military histories often overlook. Superior knowledge of terrain and better ability to move through it created tactical advantages that affected engagement outcomes. The astronomical knowledge supporting these navigation capabilities extended beyond practical wayfinding into sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Lakota astronomers understood phenomena that European science was still formalizing in the 19th century. They understood precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the celestial poles to shift over thousands of years. Oral histories describe how Polaris hadn't always been the pole star, how the sky's reference points changed over very long periods. This knowledge was maintained across generations through stories that encoded astronomical observations spanning centuries. They understood the ecliptic plane and the zodiac not as mystical constructs, but as observable patterns of solar and planetary motion. They tracked the planets, the wandering stars, and understood their retrograde motion when Mars or Jupiter appears to reverse direction against the background stars. These observations require careful attention and record-keeping that disproved the myth of Native Americans as casual skywatchers rather than systematic astronomers. Solar and lunar eclipses were understood not as supernatural events, but as predictable phenomena resulting from the alignment of celestial objects. While European astronomers in the 18th and 19th centuries were still developing tables to predict eclipses, Lakota astronomers could forecast eclipses with reasonable accuracy based on understanding of the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. This astronomical knowledge was recorded in winter counts, pictographic calendars painted on buffalo hide that documented significant events year by year. These winter counts often included astronomical observations, eclipses, meteor showers, the appearance of comets. The incorporation of celestial events into historical records demonstrates that astronomical observation was systematic and valued as important knowledge worth preserving. The astronomical sophistication of Plains peoples challenges common narratives about scientific knowledge development. European science traditionally presents itself as the unique inheritor of ancient Greek astronomy, advancing through Islamic scholars and Renaissance scientists to modern understanding. This narrative ignores or dismisses sophisticated astronomical knowledge developed independently by non-European cultures. Lakota astronomy wasn't inferior to European astronomy. It was differently focused. While European astronomers developed sophisticated mathematical models and instruments for calculation, Lakota astronomers developed sophisticated practical knowledge for navigation and seasonal tracking. Both approaches required systematic observation, theoretical understanding, and methods for transmitting knowledge across generations. The difference was application focus, not intellectual capability. The transmission of Lakota astronomical knowledge occurred entirely through oral tradition and practical demonstration. There were no written textbooks, no mathematical formulae preserved on paper. This leads some to dismiss it as less sophisticated than European scientific writing. But oral transmission of complex knowledge can be remarkably precise when supported by rigorous teaching methods and practical application. The challenge with oral knowledge transmission is that it's vulnerable to disruption. If the chain of teaching breaks, if knowledge holders die before passing on what they know, or if social disruption prevents systematic teaching, knowledge can be lost. This is exactly what happened to much Lakota astronomical knowledge during the reservation period. The reservation system, imposed on Plains tribes beginning in the 1860s, disrupted traditional knowledge transmission in multiple ways. Children were separated from elders who would have taught them, sent to boarding schools where indigenous knowledge was actively suppressed. Traditional seasonal movements that provided context for astronomical observation were prevented. The practical need for navigation knowledge decreased as tribes were confined to limited territories. The result was catastrophic knowledge loss. By the early 20th century, much of the detailed astronomical knowledge that had supported Lakota navigation was fading. Elders who still remembered the full system were dying without students to teach. The practical application that had reinforced and verified the knowledge was no longer possible. Some knowledge survived through families who maintained traditional practices despite pressure to assimilate. Some was recorded by anthropologists who recognized its value, though often incompletely or with misunderstandings. Some was encoded in stories and ceremonies that preserved fragments of the larger system. Modern efforts to reconstruct Lakota astronomical knowledge face the challenge of working from these fragments. Researchers combine anthropological records, surviving oral traditions, and astronomical analysis of what Plains peoples could have observed to piece together the system. The work is complicated by the fact that different Plains tribes had somewhat different astronomical traditions, and by the loss of specific details that oral teaching would have preserved. What's clear from the reconstruction efforts is that the system was far more sophisticated than early observers realized. When 19th century anthropologists documented Plains astronomy, they often interpreted it through the lens of European astronomical concepts, missing nuances that didn't fit that framework. Modern researchers working with tribal knowledge keepers and using more culturally appropriate approaches are revealing complexity that earlier scholars overlooked. For example, the Lakota concept of the sky road, the path stars followed across the sky, wasn't simply a poetic description. It was a sophisticated understanding of the celestial sphere's rotation, incorporating awareness of how the path varied with stellar position relative to the celestial poles. Early anthropologists sometimes recorded this as vague mythology. Modern analysis recognizes it as encoding practical astronomical knowledge. Similarly, Lakota descriptions of seasonal star positions that early observers found confusing or contradictory turn out to be extremely precise when understood in context. What seemed like inconsistency was actually detailed knowledge of how stellar patterns varied with season, latitude, and time of night. The confusion came from observers who didn't understand the sophistication of what they were recording. The revival of interest in traditional Lakota knowledge, including astronomy, has led to educational programs that teach young Lakota people the star knowledge of their ancestors. These programs face the challenge that some knowledge was lost and can't be recovered. But they've been able to reconstruct significant portions of the astronomical system by combining surviving oral tradition with systematic observation of what the sky actually shows. These educational efforts reveal how the knowledge was originally taught and why oral transmission was so effective. Learning star patterns through stories and repeated observation creates embodied knowledge that becomes intuitive. Students report that after several seasons of systematic skywatching, stellar positions and movements become automatic knowledge, accessible without conscious recall. This is exactly how traditional teaching worked, creating internalized knowledge through experience rather than memorized facts. The practical navigation skills that depended on this astronomical knowledge are also being revived. Some Lakota communities are teaching young people traditional navigation techniques, taking them on journeys where they navigate by stars alone. These experiences consistently demonstrate that the techniques work. With practice, navigators can achieve the precision that amazed European observers in the 19th century. One program in South Dakota trains young Lakota in traditional navigation, by having them plan and execute multi-day journeys using only celestial navigation. After 2 years of training, students can navigate across unfamiliar terrain with accuracy comparable to GPS. This isn't because they have supernatural abilities. It's because they've internalized knowledge through the same systematic teaching methods their ancestors used. These revival efforts matter beyond cultural preservation. They demonstrate alternative approaches to navigation and spatial awareness that remain relevant in contexts where electronic navigation fails. Military survival training has begun incorporating some plains navigation techniques, recognizing their value when GPS is unavailable and magnetic compasses are unreliable. The broader lesson from Lakota celestial navigation is about knowledge systems and how they're valued. For over a century, European and American culture dismissed Native American astronomy as primitive mythology. Educational curricula taught that systematic astronomical knowledge was a European achievement. Native Americans were characterized as superstitious people who told star stories without understanding the science behind them. This dismissal served colonial purposes. It justified the suppression of indigenous knowledge and the imposition of European educational systems. If Native Americans had no sophisticated knowledge worth preserving, then erasing their traditions to replace them with civilized education seemed justified. The reality, now undeniable from careful study of surviving knowledge and historical records, is that Plains peoples possessed astronomical and navigation knowledge that was in many ways more sophisticated for its intended purposes than contemporary European systems. They had developed this knowledge through rigorous observation and teaching across centuries. It was science, systematic, reproducible, and effective. The fact that this knowledge wasn't written down doesn't make it less scientific. The fact that it was embedded in stories and practical training doesn't make it less rigorous. The fact that it served different purposes than European astronomy doesn't make it less valuable. These are all judgments based on cultural bias, not on actual evaluation of the knowledge itself. Thomas Whitmore, who nearly died on the Dakota Plains in 1862, understood this. His later writings, published in a small Kansas newspaper in 1873, describe his experience with the Lakota navigator and acknowledge explicitly that the man who saved his life possessed knowledge Whitmore himself lacked. Whitmore wrote that he had traveled to the plains believing he understood navigation. He had a compass, maps, and experience traveling in the eastern states. The storm that almost killed him taught him that his understanding was inadequate for plains conditions. The Lakota hunter who guided him to safety possessed knowledge that Whitmore described as more sophisticated than anything he had learned in school. The navigator could determine position, direction, and approximate time using only the sky and his understanding of it. He maintained precise bearing through conditions where Whitmore's compass spun uselessly. He demonstrated capabilities that Whitmore had believed were impossible without instruments. Whitmore's writings are notable because they explicitly credit the Lakota navigator and acknowledge the sophistication of his knowledge. Most accounts from European settlers either dismiss indigenous navigation skills as luck or innate ability, something savages had naturally, rather than knowledge they had developed systematically. Whitmore understood he had witnessed scientific knowledge and skill, and he said so directly, despite the cultural prejudices of his time. His account includes details about how the navigator worked that provide insight into the practical application of Lakota astronomy. Whitmore describes how, during brief breaks in the blizzard, the navigator would stop, look at whatever stars were visible, and then resume walking with slightly adjusted direction. Whitmore realized the navigator was continuously updating his bearing based on stellar observations, maintaining accuracy through constant refinement, rather than following a single fixed direction. This continuous navigation, adjusting heading based on multiple observations over time, rather than setting a direction and following it rigidly, is more sophisticated than compass navigation. A compass provides a single fixed bearing, but that bearing may be wrong due to magnetic deviation, and following it rigidly can accumulate error. The navigator's approach of continuous observation and adjustment automatically corrected for any errors, and maintained accuracy over the entire journey. Whitmore also describes how the navigator used dead reckoning between stellar observations. Even when clouds completely obscured the sky, the navigator maintained his heading based on his awareness of his own movement. Whitmore tried to learn this skill during the 3-day journey, attempting to maintain straight-line walking without reference points. He found he consistently veered off course without realizing it. The navigator, by contrast, maintained his bearing with precision that Whitmore described as mechanical, as regular as a clock, as straight as a line drawn with a ruler. This comparison to mechanical precision is significant. Whitmore understood he was witnessing knowledge and skill that produced results comparable to instruments. The navigator's abilities weren't mystic or natural. They were learned capabilities, developed through training, that Whitmore himself lacked. This recognition of indigenous knowledge as systematic and learned, rather than innate or supernatural, is rare in historical accounts from European settlers. The practical impact of Lakota celestial navigation extended beyond individual navigation feats. The entire economy and society of Plains tribes depended on accurate navigation. Buffalo hunting, the foundation of Plains life, required coordinating movements of hunters, processing crews, and camp followers across vast territories. This coordination depended on precise navigation and timing. A buffalo hunt might involve hundreds of people spread across dozens of miles. Hunters would locate herds and send messengers back to camp with detailed information about location and distance. Based on this information, the camp would move to a new location chosen to intercept the herd after the hunt. Processing crews would travel to the kill site. All of this required navigation precision that ensured everyone arrived at the right place at the right time. The coordination was achieved through shared astronomical knowledge that allowed precise communication about location and timing. A messenger reporting a buffalo herd's location could describe it using stellar references that allowed camp leaders to determine exact distance and direction. Instructions for where to move camp could be communicated using stellar landmarks that navigators could follow precisely. Meeting times could be specified using astronomical timekeeping that everyone understood. This shared knowledge system created coordination capabilities that amazed European observers. George Catlin described witnessing a Lakota buffalo hunt where multiple groups traveled independently from different starting points, all arriving at a predetermined location within hours of each other, over 2 days of travel. The coordination seemed impossible to Catlin, who knew European military forces struggled to achieve similar synchronization with written orders and scheduled movements. The difference was that Lakota coordination didn't depend on written communication or mechanical timekeeping. It depended on shared knowledge of astronomy that provided a common reference system everyone could access. The sky was a universal clock and map that required no instruments to read once you knew how to see it. Trade relationships between Plains tribes similarly depended on astronomical navigation. Trade gatherings brought together tribes from across the plains at specific locations and times. The gathering might be scheduled for when the Pleiades rise at sunset, a precise astronomical marker that indicated a specific period of several days in autumn. Traders traveling from different directions, hundreds of miles away, would arrive during that window, confident they were meeting at the right time because they all read the same sky. These trade gatherings were essential to Plains' economy, allowing exchange of goods, information, and social connections. Their success depended on navigation and timing precision that astronomical knowledge provided. Without that shared knowledge system, coordinating gatherings of thousands of people from scattered bands would have been nearly impossible. The military applications of celestial navigation gave Plains warriors tactical advantages in conflicts with both other tribes and U.S. forces. A war party could travel at night with confidence, moving along routes that would be impossible for pursuers without similar navigation skills. They could coordinate attacks involving multiple groups approaching from different directions, achieving tactical surprise through precise timing. The ability to navigate in conditions where opponents couldn't had strategic implications. During winter, when storms made travel dangerous, Lakota warriors could move with relative confidence while their enemies were confined to camps. During nights when clouds obscured the sky, Lakota forces could reposition while opponents remained stationary. These advantages weren't absolute. Bad enough conditions prevented movement regardless of skill, but they created asymmetries that affected conflict outcomes. U.S. military forces recognized the navigation skill of Plains warriors and tried to counter it by recruiting indigenous scouts. These scouts provided not just tracking skills, but navigation knowledge that Army forces lacked. The relationship was complex. Scouts working for the Army were often from tribes in conflict with the groups they were tracking, and their motivations varied widely. But their value to military operations stemmed largely from navigation capabilities that were standard among Plains peoples, but extraordinary by European standards. The cultural significance of astronomical knowledge in Lakota society extended beyond practical navigation. Astronomy was integrated into religious belief, social organization, and identity in ways that made it central to cultural continuity. The sky wasn't just a navigation tool, it was the dwelling place of spirits, the record of history, the source of wisdom passed from ancestors to descendants. This integration meant that attacking Lakota astronomical knowledge, which the reservation system and boarding schools did systematically, wasn't just suppressing practical skills. It was attacking cultural identity and continuity. When children were forbidden to learn star stories or punished for speaking Lakota language that encoded astronomical concepts, the damage went beyond lost navigation ability. It disrupted knowledge transmission that maintained cultural coherence across generations. The deliberate suppression of indigenous astronomical knowledge reflected broader policies aimed at cultural erasure. If Native Americans could be separated from their knowledge systems, from the practices that made sense within their worldview, they could be more easily assimilated into Euro-American culture. Education policy explicitly aimed to kill the Indian, save the man, to eliminate indigenous cultural identity while preserving the individual within a supposedly superior European cultural framework. The astronomical knowledge was targeted because it was powerful. It demonstrated sophisticated understanding that contradicted narratives about primitive peoples needing civilization. By suppressing it, educational authorities could maintain the fiction that Native Americans had no knowledge worth preserving. By preventing its transmission, they could ensure the next generation wouldn't have practical skills that might support traditional ways of life. The resistance to this suppression came from individuals and families who maintained traditional practices despite pressure and punishment. Elders who continued teaching star knowledge to young people in secret. Families who took children on night walks to show them the sky roads. Communities that preserved stories and ceremonies even when forced underground. This resistance preserved fragments of knowledge that later generations could build on. The recovery of Lakota astronomical knowledge in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been led by tribal members working with researchers to document surviving traditions and reconstruct lost knowledge. This work requires combining multiple sources: elder testimony from knowledge holders who learned traditional astronomy, anthropological records despite their limitations, astronomical analysis of what Plains peoples would have observed, and practical testing of techniques to verify they work. The process has revealed how much was lost and how much survived. Core stellar patterns and their navigation uses are reasonably well documented. The detailed techniques for using stellar elevation to determine latitude can be reconstructed from descriptions and verified through practice. The integration of celestial observation with dead reckoning is understood in principle, though the specific embodied skills take years to develop. What's harder to recover is the nuance and detail that oral teaching would have conveyed. The specific stories that encoded astronomical knowledge often survived only in fragmentary form. The practical demonstrations that showed exactly how to measure angles with your arm or maintain bearing by feeling wind, are difficult to reconstruct from written descriptions. The cultural context that made astronomical knowledge meaningful within Lakota worldview is partially lost. Despite these challenges, the recovery efforts have been remarkably successful. Young Lakota people are learning traditional star knowledge and developing navigation skills that their great-great-grandparents would recognize. The astronomical knowledge is being integrated into cultural education programs that connect language, history, and practical skills. And the knowledge is being shared with wider audiences, challenging common assumptions about who developed sophisticated astronomy and navigation. The comparison between Lakota celestial navigation and European navigation systems of the same period is instructive. Both worked. Both were based on systematic observation and understanding of celestial mechanics, but they served different needs and developed different strengths. European navigation, developed primarily for maritime use, emphasized instruments and written calculations. Astrolabes, sextants, and marine chronometers allowed precise position determination, but required specialized equipment and training. Written tables and calculations allowed navigation planning, but needed literacy and access to reference materials. The system was powerful for its intended maritime context, but less practical for rapid overland movement. Lakota navigation emphasized embodied knowledge and internalized skills. No instruments were required beyond the navigator's own body and senses. No written references were needed. All necessary information was memorized or could be derived from observation. The system was optimized for overland travel, where speed and independence were valuable. It couldn't provide the precision positioning needed for maritime navigation across featureless ocean, but it provided better practical results for plains travel than European methods could achieve. Neither system was objectively superior. They were differently optimized for different contexts. The tragedy is that European colonial powers and American expansion treated their navigation methods as the only legitimate approach, dismissing indigenous systems as primitive rather than recognizing them as sophisticated alternatives worthy of study and preservation. This pattern of dismissing indigenous knowledge while simultaneously depending on it repeats throughout colonial history. European explorers and settlers relied on indigenous guides whose navigation made exploration possible. Then they wrote accounts crediting their own courage and skill while treating guides as unremarked background assistants. Indigenous knowledge was appropriated without acknowledgement, used without respect, and eventually suppressed, while European knowledge systems were imposed as universal and superior. The consequences of this pattern are visible today in how scientific history is taught. Students learn about European astronomers mapping the heavens, but rarely hear about Lakota astronomers who had mapped the night sky with equal sophistication for different purposes. Textbooks credit European navigators with developing celestial navigation, while ignoring that indigenous peoples worldwide had developed their own celestial navigation systems, often earlier, and in some contexts, more effectively. This educational erasure perpetuates the myth that systematic scientific knowledge is a uniquely European achievement. It reinforces colonial narratives about civilized Europeans bringing enlightenment to primitive peoples, and it continues the injustice of knowledge appropriation, taking indigenous knowledge, using it, then failing to credit its origins or value the people who developed it. The recovery and recognition of Lakota astronomical knowledge contributes to correcting this erasure. When young people, Lakota and otherwise, learn that Plains peoples possessed sophisticated astronomy and navigation, it challenges assumptions about who develops scientific knowledge. When the sophistication of indigenous knowledge systems is documented and taught, it becomes harder to dismiss entire cultures as primitive or incapable of systematic thought. This matters not just for historical accuracy, but for contemporary justice. The dismissal of indigenous knowledge supported and justified policies that destroyed cultures and displaced peoples. Recognizing the sophistication of that knowledge doesn't undo historical injustice. but it removes one justification that was used to commit it. It becomes impossible to claim that knowledge suppression was benevolent, bringing superior understanding to peoples who lacked it, when the evidence shows those peoples possessed knowledge systems that were in many ways more sophisticated than what replaced them. For the Lakota people and other Plains tribes, the recovery of astronomical knowledge is about more than navigation skills. It's about cultural continuity and identity. The knowledge represents connection to ancestors who developed it, to land where it was practiced, to ways of life that made sense within indigenous worldviews. Learning traditional star knowledge is learning to see the world as ancestors saw it, understanding relationships between sky, land, season, and life that shaped culture for centuries. This cultural significance means astronomical knowledge recovery is part of broader indigenous revitalization movements aimed at maintaining cultural identity despite ongoing pressure toward assimilation. When Lakota children learn star stories and practice celestial navigation, they're not just learning outdated techniques. They're connecting to cultural heritage that remains meaningful and valuable. The practical applications of recovered knowledge extend beyond cultural preservation. The navigation skills developed by Plains peoples remain useful in contexts where modern technology fails or is unavailable. Military forces, wilderness survival programs, and outdoor education initiatives have all incorporated elements of traditional navigation after recognizing its effectiveness. The mental maps and spatial awareness developed through celestial navigation training enhance cognitive abilities in ways that benefit many contexts. Research with indigenous navigators from various cultures shows they develop exceptional spatial memory and orientation abilities. These aren't innate traits. They're skills developed through training systems that emphasize embodied spatial knowledge over instrument dependence. Some researchers argue that GPS-dependent navigation reduces these spatial cognitive abilities. When people navigate by following turn-by-turn instructions without attending to their environment or their position within it, they don't develop robust mental maps. Traditional navigation systems like Lakota celestial navigation, by contrast, require constant spatial awareness that builds strong cognitive maps and orientation abilities. This suggests that traditional knowledge systems might offer cognitive benefits that modern technology-dependent approaches don't provide. Not because the traditional systems are inherently superior in all contexts, but because they develop different cognitive skills that complement or enhance abilities developed through other approaches. The broader implications of Lakota astronomical knowledge for how we think about science, knowledge, and cultural value are profound. The recovery and recognition of this knowledge system challenges fundamental assumptions that shape education, historical narratives, and cultural attitudes. First, it challenges the assumption that written knowledge is inherently superior to oral knowledge. Lakota astronomy was transmitted orally with precision that produced practical results equal or superior to written systems. This demonstrates that knowledge sophistication doesn't depend on literacy. It depends on teaching methods, social support for knowledge transmission, and practical application that tests and refines understanding. Second, it challenges the assumption that scientific knowledge develops linearly from primitive to advanced, with European science representing the pinnacle. Lakota astronomy wasn't a primitive precursor to European astronomy. It was a parallel development that emphasized different aspects and served different needs. Both represented sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Neither was objectively superior. They were optimized for different applications. Third, it challenges the assumption that indigenous knowledge is inherently mystical or spiritual rather than practical and scientific. While Lakota astronomy was integrated into cultural and spiritual frameworks, the astronomical observations and navigation techniques were rigorously empirical. They worked because they were based on accurate observation and systematic understanding, not because of spiritual power or mystical insight. Fourth, it challenges assumptions about who can develop sophisticated knowledge. The implicit bias that European peoples were uniquely capable of systematic thought and scientific observation is disproven by evidence from cultures worldwide that developed sophisticated knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, engineering, medicine, and other domains. Lakota astronomy is one example among many of indigenous scientific achievement. These challenges matter because they expose how colonial narratives about knowledge have shaped education and cultural attitudes. When science education presents systematic knowledge as a European achievement, it perpetuates cultural bias that continues to affect how people are valued and treated. When indigenous knowledge systems are dismissed or ignored, it sends messages about whose knowledge matters and whose contributions are worth recognizing. The recovery of Lakota astronomical knowledge is one piece of larger work, recovering and recognizing indigenous knowledge systems across many domains. Similar recovery efforts are documenting indigenous mathematics, engineering, medicine, agriculture, and other fields where systematic knowledge was developed but later suppressed or dismissed. The pattern repeats. Sophisticated knowledge systems developed over centuries by indigenous peoples, appropriated by colonizers when useful, then dismissed as primitive, while European knowledge was imposed as superior. Recognizing these patterns and working to correct them is essential for justice and for science. Justice requires acknowledging past wrongs and crediting knowledge to its actual origins. Science benefits from recognizing that knowledge can be developed through different methods and for different purposes, and that valuable insights can come from diverse knowledge systems. For Thomas Whitmore, nearly dying on the Dakota Plains was transformative. His writings after surviving the blizzard show someone who had confronted fundamental limitations in his own knowledge and recognized sophistication in knowledge he had dismissed. He spent the rest of his life advocating for respect toward Lakota people and knowledge, speaking against policies that suppressed indigenous education. Whitmore's transformation wasn't unique. Many Europeans who spent significant time with Plains peoples and witnessed their capabilities firsthand recognized the sophistication of indigenous knowledge. But Whitmore was unusual in writing about it explicitly and advocating for change based on that recognition. Most settlers who benefited from indigenous knowledge remained silent or even denied that debt, maintaining cultural narratives about European superiority despite personal experience that contradicted them. The silence of most settlers who learned from indigenous peoples reflects the power of cultural narratives to override personal experience. Even when people directly witnessed indigenous knowledge and skill, the broader cultural story about primitive Indians and civilized Europeans was strong enough to prevent acknowledgement. This cognitive dissonance, seeing sophistication while maintaining belief in primitiveness, was resolved by simply not talking about what was observed or by reframing it in ways that preserved existing narratives. This historical pattern has contemporary echoes. Modern society still struggles to reconcile indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge, often treating them as incompatible or in conflict. Science education presents European-descended science as universal and objective, while treating indigenous knowledge as cultural belief rather than systematic understanding. This perpetuates the same dismissal and erasure that suppressed Lakota astronomy and countless other indigenous knowledge systems. The alternative is recognizing that knowledge can take many forms, serve many purposes, and be developed through many methods. Lakota celestial navigation was scientific knowledge, systematic, testable, based on rigorous observation. It was also cultural knowledge, embedded in stories, transmitted through social relationships, meaningful within Lakota worldview. These aren't contradictions. They're different aspects of knowledge systems that integrate practical and cultural dimensions. European science presents itself as separate from culture, as objective truth independent of social context. But this separation is itself a cultural choice, not an inherent feature of knowledge. All knowledge systems are culturally embedded, shaped by values and purposes of the people who develop them. European science's claim to transcend culture is part of its cultural framework, not evidence of objectivity. Recognizing this doesn't relativize all knowledge or suggest that accuracy doesn't matter. Lakota celestial navigation worked. Navigators arrived at intended destinations with precision that demonstrated accurate understanding. European celestial navigation worked. Ships crossed oceans and arrived at ports using calculations based on accurate astronomical observation. Both systems were grounded in observation and produced practical results. The difference was context and purpose. Lakota astronomy served overland navigation on the plains, seasonal tracking for hunting and gathering, coordination of dispersed groups, and cultural needs for understanding humanity's place within creation. European astronomy served maritime navigation, calendar development, and increasingly abstract mathematical models of celestial mechanics. Both were valid, both were valuable. Neither was more scientific or advanced. They were differently focused. This understanding suggests a path forward for education and cultural engagement with indigenous knowledge. Rather than treating European science as universal truth and indigenous knowledge as interesting cultural belief, we can recognize both as sophisticated knowledge systems developed for specific purposes within specific contexts. We can teach astronomical observation using both European and Lakota frameworks, allowing students to understand different approaches and their different strengths. Such education would benefit all students. For Lakota students, it provides connection to ancestral knowledge and demonstrates that their culture produced sophisticated scientific understanding. For non-Lakota students, it challenges assumptions and demonstrates that knowledge sophistication is not culturally limited. For all students, it provides practical skills in astronomical observation and navigation, while teaching historical accuracy about knowledge development. Programs implementing this approach have shown promising results. Students engaging with both European and indigenous astronomical knowledge develop broader understanding of both. They learn to recognize sophistication in different forms. They develop critical thinking about how knowledge is developed, transmitted, and valued. And they often show stronger practical skills in astronomical observation because they're learning multiple frameworks for understanding the same phenomena. The recovery of Lakota celestial navigation contributes to larger conversations about decolonizing education and recognizing indigenous knowledge. It provides concrete example of sophisticated indigenous scientific achievement that can counter dismissive narratives. It demonstrates that recovery is possible even when knowledge has been suppressed and partially lost. And it shows that indigenous knowledge remains practically valuable and culturally significant today. For the Lakota people and other Plains tribes, this recovery is ongoing. Elders continue to share what they remember. Researchers continue to document and analyze. Young people continue to learn and practice traditional skills. The knowledge that nearly died during the reservation period is being revived and strengthened, ensuring that future generations will maintain connection to ancestral understanding. The night sky over the plains looks the same as it did when Lakota navigators used it to guide hunting parties, coordinate gatherings, and rescue lost travelers. Polaris still marks north. The Pleiades still rise in autumn. The Milky Way still arcs across the darkness. The stars are unchanged. What changed was knowledge, systematically suppressed, partially lost, now being recovered and revived. When modern Lakota students look at that sky and see not just random points of light, but a navigational system their ancestors mastered, they're reclaiming heritage that colonialism tried to erase. When they practice celestial navigation and achieve the precision their ancestors demonstrated, they're proving that sophisticated knowledge wasn't lost. It was waiting to be remembered. The stars are still there. The knowledge is still accessible. What's needed is commitment to learning, teaching, and preservation, and recognition that this knowledge matters, not just for navigation skills, but for understanding human capability, cultural value, and historical truth. Thomas Whitmore understood this in 1862 when a Lakota hunter saved his life. The navigator knew the sky in ways Whitmore had never imagined possible. That knowledge wasn't luck or mysticism or natural ability. It was science, systematic, sophisticated, and effective. Whitmore had the humility to recognize that and the integrity to say so. Modern society faces the same choice Whitmore faced: acknowledge the sophistication of indigenous knowledge or maintain convenient narratives about primitive peoples and European superiority. The evidence is clear. The question is whether we have the humility and integrity to see it. The blizzard is long past. The hunter who guided Whitmore through it is gone, along with his generation and several that followed. But the knowledge he carried, the star patterns, the navigation techniques, the astronomical understanding, is being recovered and passed forward. The sky roads he followed are still there, waiting for those who learn to see them. For anyone willing to look up and learn, the stars tell stories of human ingenuity, systematic observation, and knowledge that transcends cultural boundaries. The same sky that guided Lakota hunters across the plains can still teach lessons about navigation, astronomy, and the many forms sophisticated knowledge can take. The stars don't care about our cultural narratives. They shine the same for everyone. The question is whether we're willing to learn from all the people who learn to read them, or whether we'll continue privileging some knowledge while dismissing others. The sky doesn't change. What changes is our humility to recognize sophistication wherever it appears and whoever developed it. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring the Old West archives with us.